Welcome to the Communication Workshop. I'm Abby Wick. I'm the NDSU Extension Soil Health Specialist. So I work primarily with farmers, with other educators, including our county agents and our CS organizations, anyone that brings information out to people that are going to put it on the ground. So that's my role at NDSU.
My name is Tim Hamrich. I work in communications consulting. I have been hosting the Soil Sense podcast along with Abby for the last over a year now, almost 2 years going on for that podcast, and I've been in communications for several years.
Jean Haley is going to talk a little bit more about collecting usable knowledge. And ever since I met Jean, it's been about usable knowledge, like she said, because if it's not usable, it's just trivia. So we'll bring Jean back on through Zoom, and she has a presentation that she'll walk through again. And Jean, I hope it's okay that we'll keep asking questions as you go through the presentation on things that pique some interest and questions we get in the Q&A.
Yes, please, absolutely do, because I'm not quite able to watch that while I'm trying to, watch my slides. So that would be really helpful. Yep, I'm still Jean Haley. I'm still usable knowledge. I'm still in Bloomington, Indiana. I do want to mention that somebody in the earlier, in the morning session did ask about logic models, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And somebody also mentioned that they were having difficulty getting surveys back after events. And I am actually going to dive a little bit into surveys more deeply, since that is the most common thing that we are using. So let's just recap. If we go to the next slide, let's recap very quickly. We covered these first three things this morning very briefly, but evaluation is that system. You decide to evaluate, or the decision is made for you, and then you need to do your needs assessment. You need to develop a framework, and then you need to select your methods. Evaluation does not always equal surveys as much as we want them to. There are just so many other more useful and creative things that you could be doing other than surveys, and sometimes they provide better data, but they also are more efficient and more economical for you. So a quick recap of our needs assessment. Let's go to the next slide. So our needs assessment, that's what do you need to evaluate? Why do you need to evaluate it? Who does it need to serve? And don't forget yourself. When does it need to be done? What's your time frame? Do you have 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? And what's your budget? Can you build a canoe, or can you build, an ocean liner? What have you got? What are your resources that you can put into it? So on the next slide, this is going to help a little bit with that question about the logic model. So logic models, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, you have evaluators to blame for these. I'm very sorry for it. But they are actually a very useful tool, because they do describe the logic of your program, starting with your inputs. What are your resources that you're putting into a program? What are the activities that you're going to do? What are some of the outputs? What are the publications or field days, or those kinds of things? Those are some of your outputs. And then how are those outputs going to lead to your outcomes, your desired impacts? How is that going to affect change in any way? So this is kind of the flow of a logic model. And in grants where you're required to do these logic models, you've always got outputs and outcomes. And these are things like activities or goals and objectives, really. If you're not using that outcome language, other people use, what are your objectives for your program, or what are your goals, or what are you trying to do? And I'm constantly asking, that first question: what is your desired outcome? You're going to do this field day. So what's your desired outcome? Well, when you're starting to put together your evaluation framework, a really good idea is to just create a spreadsheet. And it could be very simple. That first column, just start going down and listing all the outcomes and outputs or objectives or goals that you've got. Go ahead and throw them all in there, even if you're not going to evaluate them all, because you don't have time or money to do all of the things, as we all well know. But if you get them all down there, then it's going to be a lot easier to prioritize. So once you've got your outputs and your outcomes in there, then the next thing you can do is start brainstorming some of your indicators of success, okay? So if increased knowledge is one of your outputs or outcomes, then you could some of the indicators would be self-reported knowledge change. So this would be something you'd get back on a survey, where you ask them, what was your knowledge on this topic beforehand? What was your knowledge afterwards? And then we can measure some knowledge change. But we can also measure that knowledge change using that pre-test, post-test method. And that could be, test scores or quiz scores are going to increase over time. That's your indicator. So you can use pre-test, post-test, or you could use the polls, that polling technology that Marisol and Peter were talking about this morning. Always assign it to somebody. And always give it a deadline, because if nobody's in charge, it's not going to get done. And if there's no deadline, it's not going to get done. So this is just a really simple organizational tool for, laying out a plan for your evaluation, because you've done your needs assessment, and that's all of those first three things kind of fit together. What you need to evaluate and why you need to evaluate it is going to come into that prioritization that you're going to do, and that ranking of, all right, which ones of these are more important for us to look at? So this is an indicator table that usually you could pull straight out of your logic model if you've got one. But again, if you don't have a logic model, just start with your objectives and your outcome and your goals. One of the things that I would like to also stress is to not completely disregard process, how things happen. Because if you measure your outcomes and they're not quite what you want to see happening, you don't have any data on how it happened to get there. So if you don't have any data on what brought you there, it's going to be really hard to improve. You're going to make some stabs in the dark. And so if you've got some data on your activities and your process and what you were doing in order to affect this change, that's going to help you continue to improve. And that's going to be another key component of getting some usable knowledge. You can't really divorce the outcome from the activities and the outputs that got you there, right? As much as we'd like to. Don't just focus on those outcomes. So a quick recap of some of the methods that I mentioned this morning is on the next slide. And somebody had put in the questions this morning, wondering what are some of these other methods. I hope that I partially answered that by going through all of these different things. And there's some examples that Abby shared about, how observation has helped and how knowing some network analysis has helped. And focus groups are sometimes you don't need to ask all the people all the things. Maybe you just need 8 or 10 people to go into more depth about a question. We might be able to identify some barriers to adoption if we list some very specific categories, and they can tell us that these are barriers, but we don't really know why or anything deeper about that, or how we might possibly change those from being barriers for them. And so in that case, you're going to want a focus group and be able to talk to people more in depth. The other thing is too, along that same lines of fewer people, maybe you just need to do a case study with 3 or 5 farmers, right? Look at these guys who are the furthest along in the adoption continuum, and look at what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it and what's it costing them, and go in depth with these guys so that you've got a model to show other people about what happens and how it happens and when it happens. Because a lot of these things, they just take time. And so if you try it this year and it doesn't work, maybe you just need to keep trying because it didn't work for them the first time either. So again, you don't need to always have all the information from all the people. Sometimes a small subset of those people are really going to, provide you with really useful information.
Jean,
so there's all of these. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you about focus groups? So if you're, I guess picking your focus group would depend on your objective, right? So if you want to get at the long-term soil health practices, you would pick a subset of farmers who've been using this practice a long time, or new adopters, you would pick a subset of that. Say you just need to generally know how a program is working. Do you just pick people at random for that focus group, or how would you go about that to make sure that your eyes are open through the process?
Great question. I would always be very purposeful about who you're inviting to the table. And depending on what it is that you want to know, you might want to get, the range of the non-adopter to the early adopter at the table to get that conversation going. That's going to produce a very different conversation than 8 to 10 guys who are all doing the thing, right? And so it all depends, again, on what it is that you want to know. And so once you have that research question, your evaluation question, your needs assessment done, you can go back to that and say, all right, what's the best way for us to get this information? Is it going to be from, a wide variety of folks, or is it going to be from just having, those guys who do the good stuff, or just the guys who don't want to do the good stuff because you want to do, figure out what some of the barriers are. Sometimes it's also just a matter of who can you get to the table for a couple hours, right? And that can just be the case. Sometimes that's just how it has to be. I did a project several years ago on apples, and one of the partners was Cornell in New York, and I just had a couple of contacts in New York, some extension folks who were helping me put together the focus group, and I just had to depend on them to get people to the table to talk to me about barriers. In this particular project, they were going to build some new technology, and so we wanted to get from them, what are these potential barriers that we're not aware of, so that we can address these in our research. We also wanted to get from them also, what are the potential opportunities, so we knew how to talk about and talk it up and market this new technology that was being developed. And I was strictly bound by who we could get to the table. And in this case, it was a piece of technology that didn't exist. So it was who were the guys who could, they could cash in their chips to get at the table, right? Did that answer the question, Abby, a little bit?
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a little some guidance on who do you bring to the table to help you guide these processes. So no, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. And because we want to be purposeful. And sometimes it is purposeful to do a random sample, right? Just to, pull some names out of a hat. But with focus groups, I try to be way more purposeful. So I'm going to dive into surveys, unless there are some other questions about any of these other methods that are up here, and go into this a little bit more deeply, because so many people are using them and they are very useful. And especially nowadays, because we can do them online, they are much more economical to do. Back in the day, it was relatively recently that I started doing online surveys with growers. Up until pretty recently, I was doing all paper surveys, mailback surveys, and that's very expensive, right? And time consuming. But these online surveys are a lot faster, and that's probably why we're so inundated with them. So next slide. You need to know a few things before you start developing your survey instrument. You need to know your evaluation question. I'm going to keep, hammering on that, right? You need to know what it is that you want to know and what's necessary to know and why you want to know it. You need to know your target population. Some of the guys in media this morning talked about, knowing your audience, and this is important as well in survey research. Knowing who your target population is and being able to define who those people are is necessary. Are you going to survey all the growers? Are you just going to survey the growers who have cover crops? Or are you just going to survey the growers who have irrigation? Or are you just going to serve carrot growers? Right? So know who it is. Or is it that we really want to talk to the consultants? Because this is more an issue about, having the consultants bring the information out. So we need to get information back from them. So who is your target audience? Who's your population? How are you going to sample that? The next thing you need to decide if you're going to do a survey is what type of survey you're going to use, right? So some of you might be going, wait, what? There's more types of surveys than one? Well, there are. So next slide. And as I go through these, you're just going to keep clicking on your clicker, whoever's, there we go. So we got paper surveys first, and we all know what those are, paper and pen. And then we've got online surveys. If you're not using Qualtrics, you're probably using SurveyMonkey or one of the others, but Qualtrics is, definitely the best. And then you've also got interviews. Interviews are considered surveys. In person, one-on-one, you've got a clipboard or an iPad or a whatever, and you're actually having an interview conversation. But because everybody's answering that same list of questions, that's a survey. You can also do interviews on the telephone, and old school, and now new school, we can actually do them via Zoom, right? So these are all the different types that you can do. One of our biggest jobs when we are doing surveys is to reduce error wherever we can, okay? It's the same when you're doing any other scientific research, right? We want to control all the variables we can control. And that's going to help account for error. There are 4 kinds of error, but we're going to really focus in on measurement error because we have limited time. And if I'm going too fast, just pop something in the chat there and let me know, and just stop me, because I know I'm being a total talking head, and unlike the other presentations, it's just me. So don't be afraid to pop questions in, and then Abby will be happy to interrupt me. So measurement error, the first source of measurement error is the respondent themselves, right? So they need to be able and willing to respond to your survey. So what does it mean to be willing to respond? You need to give them a good reason to take their time out of their day to respond to your survey, right? So when you're getting a hold of them, or when you're sending them that message, or writing them your cover letter, or however it is you're asking them to participate, you need to make sure that they know why you're collecting the data, how you're going to use that data, and what's in it for them. And sometimes, it seems like, well, we're just asking them to do what's in it for them. Well, sometimes that's $4.2 million worth of research that you got a grant for, right? That's not nothing, right? So we don't always have to ask, have a raffle for a chainsaw or an Amazon gift card. We don't always have to give people a hat, because we are actually giving them $4.2 million worth of research findings. So make sure they know, why this is important and why you need them to help you with your data collection. They need to be able to respond, and that means that your questions really need to be very clear. And it needs to be in whatever your audience language is. And I'm not talking about French or Chinese. I'm talking about extension speak is not always the same as grower speak. Academic speak is certainly not always the same as grower speak. Some of the earlier speakers this morning were talking about, don't use this jargon and the hypertext sort of language. Same thing in your surveys. You need to take all that jargon out. I mean, unless you're surveying ag engineers, and in which case, yeah, use all the ag engineer, jargony tech language that you want, because they're going to understand it. But if it's not the native tongue for whoever it is that you are surveying, then you're going to have problems getting good data out of it. The best way to avoid this problem of having questions that are just too confusing, or they don't understand, or is not in their same language, is to pilot test your surveys. Always pilot test it, and always pilot test it with your intended audience, right? So by all means, have your extension agent pals, your colleagues, review it and make sure it all works properly, especially online now, since there's all the technical stuff. Make sure all the skip logic works and all those things. And have them do that and look for typos, or, I couldn't click on all that apply, I could only click on one. These are some of the things that happen, and we want to avoid those things too. But in order to make sure that you're asking the question that you think you're asking, you need to actually ask the people who are going to be filling it out in the end. So,
Gene, question on that.
Yeah.
With surveys that we're emailing people about, we're lucky to maybe get 40% of the people to open the email, and then maybe lucky to get 8% of them to click on any link. What can we expect in terms of actually getting people to complete a survey? And is there anything we can do to increase the chances of that? I mean, I know you're mentioning make sure they know why it's happening, but anything to make sure that we actually can get enough surveys in?
Yeah, so that why thing is really one of the, the biggest things. And the second thing is, don't go into a cold audience, right? So if there's, at all possible, warn them ahead of time that they're going to be getting a survey, and be excited about it. At this meeting, at the end of the meeting, we're going to say, hey, you're going to get a survey, please help us out. And the other thing is that there are very specific steps that you can take to go through increasing your response rate. The king of there have been dissertations written on this. Believe it or not, folks, people go to school for this. And as crazy as that might sound, the king of this is Don Dillman, and that's probably got a lot of glare on it. But it's going to come up at the end. And he's written a book called The Total Design Method. And he started this back in 1978 and has updated it as the technology has come along. And one of the things that increases your response rate is a warning that they're going to get the survey, an invitation with the survey in it, and then a certain number of days later, you send a reminder to all the people who haven't responded, and you send a thank you to the people who have, and then a certain number of days after that, you resend the survey. And then if you haven't reached your desired response rate, you could do it one more time, but I wouldn't do it. They're going to hate you at that point. At that point, you need to decide, do I have enough people, or do I maybe need to get on the horn and try to get more people to do it? Sometimes, bringing people in to help you, help solicit, responses. Maybe I'm not the right guy to be sending that email. Maybe we need to get Abby because they like Abby. They know who she is, and they're like, oh, I'll do anything for Abby. So I'll go in and I'll fill out that survey. So pull out, whatever resources that you've got in order to really encourage people to respond. Back in the day when I first started 20 years ago, I could guarantee my clients a 75% response rate. That's not happening anymore. But I can, if I can't get 50% of response rate, I can usually get 50% of the acres. And that was mostly in specialty crops. So I don't know how well that would go with corn and soy, but yeah, it is hard. So really, making your case for why it's important and what's in it for them. And then the repeated. You don't want to be, spammy about it. You want to wait a couple of days. You don't want to send it out at 8 a.m. and then send it again at 8 p.m. Say, hey, why haven't you done this? That's just going to get people to delete you right away.
I think that's where some of those good things, those relationships that we talked about earlier, building relationships, so that when I send out a survey, people know that it actually means something to me personally if they respond, that they're helping me in my profession and my ability to create opportunities for them. And I think Jean and I sent an email like that as kind of a last ditch effort on a survey one time to just say, listen, this means a lot to me. And if, and that was, we got another, dozen or more responses just within the next hour. And so I think those relationships that you build during the meeting and those connections that you build will then help those evaluation responses come in too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that question, Tim. So back to this measurement error, the type of question that the questionnaire that you're using has built-in error. Paper surveys are always going to have more error because we have to do data entry and we're humans, and so we're going to make mistake. Paper surveys also have the opportunity for people to circle 2 numbers instead of 1. They decide that there are 1.5 instead of a 1 or a 2, and so they'll circle 2, and so that creates error. But more importantly, the wording of your question is going to influence whether or not you're going to get usable knowledge, data out the other end that you're going to actually be able to use. So let's look at some tips for how to word questions and how to structure them. That's on the next slide. The first thing, again, goes back to that comment about, know your audience. You need to know who it is that you're surveying, who it is that's going to answer these questions, and then you need to ask that in their language that they understand. So is it all the farmers, or is it just the guys who are doing, the irrigation? And you can have this, within a survey, you can break out populations, right? So I often will have, if I'm asking a bunch of practices questions, I might ask, do you irrigate? And if the answer is yes, then they go on to another set of questions, 2 or 3 more questions. If they don't, then they skip down to the next section. And so they don't ever have to see that. It's so much easier with the computer now with the paper surveys. I'd get guys who don't irrigate answering all the irrigation questions. So we have fewer errors that way now, but really you need to make it clear who the people are and so that they can answer the question. You need to ask questions for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is not because it could be really interesting to know. Early on in my career, I was known as the so what girl. I would come to a meeting and we would try to figure out and hammer out what people want to know and what needs to go on the survey. And every now and then I'd get, hey, well, it'd be really interesting to know this. Well, it needs to pass the so what test. So when people would say that, I would respond with, okay, 75% of your respondents responded this way, said this. So what? What are you going to do with that information? If you don't know what you're going to do with that information, it's not usable knowledge. It's trivia. It would be kind of cool stuff to know, but we don't need to know it. So we're not going to waste the grower's time filling out the survey, and we're not going to waste the project's time and money having me try to figure out what that data means, when it's just kind of cool information to know. So very specific purpose for each of your questions. Otherwise, garbage in, garbage out. So next, thank you. Next slide. So keep your questions neutral. No leading questions. So you have, let's take it, for example, you have a scale of extremely difficult to extremely easy. And you have these two options. How hard was it to incorporate cover crops into your system? Or what was your experience with incorporating cover crops into your system? Which one of those do you think would be better? You can write 1 or 2 in the comments and tell me what you think. Which one would be the optimal choice in this? We got 2s. We got 2s. We got 2s. Anybody with a 1? No 1s. No takers. Awesome. Great. You guys rock. Right. So even though this seems pretty innocuous, asking them how hard was it to incorporate cover crops, you're assuming it was hard. And so you're leading them to answer that on the difficult side rather than on the easy side. Okay. So sometimes it's not as obvious as we think it is, but try to be as neutral as you can. Keep that bias out. We've all had those biased questions, especially from the political pollsters. They try to steer you towards whatever it is that they want you to answer. And sometimes it's really obvious, do you want this delicious steak or do you want a plain peanut butter sandwich? Well, we've just presented this really delicious steak versus a peanut butter sandwich. And unless you're a vegetarian, we know we're going for that delicious steak, right? So next slide. This is going to seem obvious, but it's not. One question at a time, people. No double-barreled questions. This is one of the most common mistakes I see in surveys. And peanut butter always, yes. This is one of the most common mistakes that I see. If you see the word and or in your question, red flag, stop, look at it, and make sure you're not asking 2 questions. Do you use cover crops to attract pollinators and to control soil erosion? Well, I do it to control soil erosion. It's great that it attracts pollinators too, but really I'm just doing it to control soil erosion. So how do I answer that question, right? So you've just created a scenario where we've got bad data that we need to throw out because we don't know. Because then if you report, 90% of the respondents are planting cover crops to attract pollinators. Well, that's kind of a lie, right? We don't know that that's the case. So split that into 2 questions. That or can also, it can be an or and it's fine. Like, how difficult or easy was it to do this? And that kind of an or is just fine. But if you have like a list, I've seen people with 6 things in a list, this and this and this and this and this and this and this, or this and or that, or that, or that, or that. How am I supposed to answer that if I, want to say yes to 3 of them, but no to 4 or 5 of them? It happens a lot more commonly than we think we do. So just pay attention. This is a big issue that we have. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about structure. The structure of your question also matters, and this can be a source of error. You've got basically 4 types of questions. You've got an open-ended, fully open-ended question. You've got a partially closed-ended question, which is a question. We know what an open-ended question is. We're going on a fishing expedition and they just have to write in the blank, fill in, whatever your answer is. Partially closed is when you've got a list of things, but you're not sure your list is complete. So you also ask that other, and they get to write in. So you've got that bit that's not a quantitative piece. Closed-ended, unordered choices. This is when you've got a couple of different choices, but there's no, inherent scale in it. So what information source, which of these information sources do you use for cover crops? And you list 4 or 5 different information sources and they select the ones that they use. There's no inherent, hierarchy to those answers. Close-ended order choices, these are the ones that have any kind of scale. So, excellent, good, fair, poor, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Pardon me, all those scale type questions that we have, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Did I say that one already? As you move down this list, it gets a lot easier to analyze, cleaner and easier to analyze your data, and it goes a lot quicker too. So if you've got a purely open-ended question, that's going to give you purely qualitative data. And qualitative data means that you're going to spend a lot of time reading answers and narrative and doing content analysis. So you're going to analyze a lot of words and a lot of paragraphs sometimes. I always, you can't avoid them. You don't always know exactly what it is you need to know until you ask that open-ended question. And then maybe next year I can build my list off of that. I always end every one of my surveys with an open-ended question that is there anything else you'd like to share with us about X, about this field day or cover crops in general? Because somebody's just spent a fair amount of time telling you all the things that you wanted them to tell you, and they had that one thing they wanted to share with you. And so give them the opportunity to do that. But anytime you can get a list, get a list. I've got just one more slide here. I know we're right at about.
You have a question on that, Jean, real quick.
Yeah.
Is there a too long when it comes to surveys? I know you want to ask the questions that you want the answers to, but is there just like it's unreasonable to request someone to spend this much time on a survey? It's just too long.
Yes, that's a great question. But again, I'm a social scientist, so I'm always going to say it depends. So it does always depend on your context. There are certain surveys that I do that are 25 to 30 minutes, that takes them 25 to 30 minutes to fill out. But they're very in-depth, and it takes that time, and it's worth it to them in the end. Also, ag census surveys, those are pretty long. But again, yeah, we want to keep them as short as we possibly can. If you could keep it under 10 minutes max, it depends on what it is that you're asking them. Sometimes you can get away with a 3 to 5 minute. I just need to know 2 or 3 things from you. So go back to that needs assessment. What's absolutely necessary? And anything else is just extra stuff that you don't need to be asking them and don't be needing to take up their time. I know that was clear as mud, but again, it's always going to be that context that drives how long you can expect people to hang out on a survey. But that does bring up the point of, back to that pilot test. One of the things that I'm doing when I'm pilot testing a survey is I'm figuring out exactly how long it takes somebody to take that survey. Because there's nothing worse than somebody, asking you to complete this, take 2 minutes to complete this survey. And then I'm like 8 minutes in, I'm like, wait, you just lied to me. I'm bailing, I'm out of here, right? I'm not going to fill out an 8-10 minute survey when you just told me it was only going to take me 2 minutes. So let people know reasonable expectations. If it's going to take 5 to 10 minutes, tell them 5 to 10 minutes. If it's going to take 10 to 15 minutes, tell them that, right? Don't lie to them. And then they're going to, you're going to have a better chance that they're going to actually finish the survey. Pardon me, we're going to finish the survey for you. So yeah, keep it as short as you possibly can, because you're going to get more people finishing the survey. But depending on the situation, a longer survey could be merited. Thanks, Tim.
I remember, Jean, going through some of those pilot testing, and I remember feeling a little bit uncomfortable with asking, a subset of farmers to, 5 or 6 of them to answer these questions and go through the survey once, and then they'd have to go through it again, because I felt so badly about wasting their time. And they actually really appreciated going through it. And a lot, there's maybe a quarter of the questions that they interpreted very differently from how we asked them, or how I thought the response we were going to get. And so it was really, really helpful. And I found actually that when you ask farmers to pilot those surveys and to take the time to tell you how long it's going to take, and then if the questions are good, that they feel like they're part of the survey and they own the survey a little bit too. It's their information now that they're getting versus just NDSU's. So I thought that was kind of a unique experience. I thought the total opposite. Like I was asking people to do way too much, but turns out it's a good idea.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. And that's, and that's an excellent point, because it is hard at the first, because you feel like, oh my gosh, they get double whammied, right? They gotta, not only are going to fill this out with me and then spend another 15 minutes on the phone with me, because I go through every single question on the survey with them. So this is for online surveys now. When I had paper surveys, I actually went, I would, fly to Mississippi and do a focus group with, I'd have 12 guys sitting at a table taking that survey at the same time. And I would time them that way. But now online, it's really easy. I don't get to actually have conversation among several of them, which can be helpful if I have to rewrite a question. But yeah, it's like, oh, and then, oh, by the way, you have to fill it out again because we're going to change some of the questions. So that earlier data doesn't really count. So that is kind of a hard ask at first, but like Abby said, they do appreciate it, because when we go through each one of those questions, I'm calibrating my instrument. I'm making sure it's measuring what I want it to measure and what I think it's measuring. And if they interpreted a question differently, I spend that time right there with them, getting the wording down in their language in a way that they understands it, and in the way that they would understand it and that other growers would understand it. And I can't tell you how important that is, to get that feedback, because otherwise you're just going to end up throwing out questions, because it's going to be obvious sometimes when you have a question in there that didn't really work. It's going to be obvious. Oh, this data doesn't make any sense the way it's coming out the other end. So I think it was a bad question. We're not going to analyze that data. Thanks, Abby. Thanks for that plug for the pilot test, because it's a really important component.
Jean, we have 2 questions on the screen. Do you want to finish your last slide and then we'll ask you those 2 questions? Does that make the most sense?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay.
Just quickly, very quickly, the other survey tip, order does matter, and there's all sorts of research that goes into it. But in a nutshell, start with the easiest questions first, and demographics go at the end. Okay, I see a lot of surveys starting with demographics, and those are really personal questions. How many acres do you grow? That's a very personal question to start with, right? So start with whatever's easiest. What information sources do you use? That's a lot easier. What sessions did you attend? That's pretty easy. And as you go down, you can get more personal, but you need to build a little bit of trust. Demographics always go at the end. Sometimes you need to do it at the beginning because you got to weed out. Like when I was on a project and we only had time and money to answer the data, to analyze the data from 3 specific states. So if they didn't grow in those 3 specific states, then they went straight to the end of the survey. Age and acres. So somewhere along the line, somebody decided that it was, better to ask categories for this data. And I disagree with this wholeheartedly. There's always, going to be somebody who disagrees with me on this one, but you can't do math on categories, right? So if you get 50% of your respondents grow between 50 and 100 acres, how am I going to talk about potential impact on acres? I can't do math on that, right? I can't get an average. I can't get a sum. I can't get any of that. And the same goes for ages. When I'm presenting the data, I'll crank that down into some, usable categories so that we can make a nice pretty bar chart out of it. But, before that, I can't do any math. I can't find out what the median age is of our respondents, which can be really important, knowing the min and the max, and finding out what that range is, especially as, we're scared of losing all our growers because they're aging out, right? So are we bringing in new and younger growers? Well, we can kind of figure that out with categories, but if you can ask a straight up data question, get the data that you can actually do math on, and pilot test your instrument. So what are my questions?
Okay, let's see. The first one is, how do you determine a successful knowledge gain or successful knowledge gain or change in behavior? So what's successful when we ask that question?
So you're going to be the one who defines success. And that is often one of the most difficult things, right? Defining success, that's part of the what you need to evaluate and why you need to evaluate it, assessment that you're going to be doing. Is it, and it depends on your scale. I wouldn't have your scale too big. If you've got a double-sided scale where it's strongly agree to strongly disagree on some items, then you want them to be on that positive side. If it's a straight up knowledge question, like how much knowledge did you have before and how much did you have after, and your scale is I knew nothing to I know a lot, very much, or whatever your end scale point is, you're going to have to be the one to decide, what that is. What does that look like? And sometimes you just need to collect that data a few times to figure out what's reasonable to expect. We don't want to see arrows going backwards, right? That's for sure. We definitely want to see all the arrows going forwards. And then we can compare them amongst themselves. So you can rank order them in the most change that happened. Did people jump from 2 to 4 or 2 to 5, or, what was that gain? So you're going to have to be the judge of that, if that was good enough knowledge gain. If you have a baseline, next time what you can do is try to beat that baseline, right? And if you have arrows that are going the wrong way, or a dot right on top of another dot for, how far on that scale they went, maybe you don't invite that speaker back, or you figure out, all right, there's something in the way that this was communicated, or there's some difficulty here. Can we dig in and find out what the hang up is? Is it that the presentation wasn't clear, or the workshop wasn't, well organized, or, what was it? Because then you can dig in deeper. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good space. In some of our meetings, Jean, that you've evaluated, we've had both the survey question at the end, but then we also had observational information being collected during the presentation, so we can make sense of some of those. Why didn't people gain knowledge? And so the moderator is writing down notes or checking boxes or columns to make sure that we have that information to go with it, to understand why that knowledge gain maybe wasn't as much as we expected, or as much as the other sessions. And I think that's been a really nice way to use two tools to get at some deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anytime you can, triangulate or get two or more different data sources to answer a question, that's just going to give you stronger data, more reliable data. Yeah, pro tip, don't put any differential equations in your slides.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And we might not have known that unless we were there. I mean, that didn't happen in any of your workshops, Abby, but I did have some crazy scientists put up some crazy equations at a workshop I was at, and I thought, okay, this is problematic.
So that brings me to another point, Jean, that what we've done with our meetings too, and I think this is a good one, is we put together a summary sheet for people who are presenting to say, number one, this is your audience based on prior surveys or evaluations. This is what they've been learning. This is what they appreciate most. This is what you can expect, and kind of help people understand that the audience are, better understand the audience they're presenting to. So they're not coming in with differential equations to a bunch of farmers that really don't want to see the equations. So I think that kind of guiding your presenters too could be a really good tool, so that people don't come in the dark.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I see this question. There's two questions here about IRB. I will touch on that. I'm not going to go in depth on that, but if you are doing, especially, in grants, it's kind of funny. I would read these, grant evaluation. People say we don't have, IRB is not applicable. It's like, but you're doing a survey. So we are humans and we are human subjects. Therefore, we have to go through IRB. 99% of the time, I can't imagine. Well, there are examples, but 99% of the time, for what you're surveying for in our field, you're going to be exempt under number 2. Which basically says, is this, a survey, or is it, feedback from a classroom setting? They give a couple of settings, and then there's an exception. The exception is if you can identify who a person is, and by knowing their responses, this could hurt them, their reputation, or financially, or put them in jail, then you have to go through a full review. My recommendation is to just do the IRB. The best thing you can do is make a friend in the IRB office, because everybody there wants you to be able to do your research. As much as we all hate IRB, those guys really want you to be able to do your research. And so they will help you and help you figure out how to avoid some of the pitfalls. Sometimes I get hung up on my social network surveys, because I'm asking people for specific names, right? And IRB gets a little jittery when because we can definitely identify who those people are, right? So I have to be able to guarantee that I'm going to keep all that information confidential, and so that I'm not going to let them get let that data get out. And in the event that that data does get out, it's not going to hurt these people financially, or with their reputation in their community, or in any kind of legal way. So just do it. It's a pain. It's getting better with IRB. They're actually extending their exemption ratings these days. It's like you can get an exemption for an entire project if all you're doing is surveying people to get feedback. And once they know what it is that you're doing, they can say, okay, you're good. You're good to go. But if you change your instruments, you got to come back and let us review it to make sure. And IRB is there for a reason. People do horrible things to other people. It's just how it is. Since the beginning of time, I'm sure you've heard all of the horror stories about the psychology tests of, that took place with the jails, and the kids who had to press a button to inflict pain every time somebody got something wrong. Okay. These were studies that were being done, and they were being done to other humans, and they had lasting psychological effects on them. So, the fact is that people do bad things. And so it's there for a reason. So just comply. And they can also give you tips. Did that help answer the folks who were wondering about IRB?
For the communications guy here, can you just say what IRB is real quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the internal review board. So so this is particularly important in the medical fields and, psychology and sociology. Anytime you are doing research that involves human subjects, human people, you need to send your research through this review board, and they're going to sign off on it to make sure that you're not going to have lasting psychological damage or physical damage. And, some of the things they want to make sure that you're not lying to people and, things like that. And if you are, or you're tricking them in some way, there has to be a really good reason. And so they review your research. People hate doing it, but here's the thing: you have to do all the things that they require anyway. You have to write your solicitation message anyway. You just have to write your instrument anyway. So now it's going to be done and out of the way, and it's not going to be the night before the field day, and you're going to be trying to, do your survey. So, yeah, and it's a good thing.